It is Indiana in the Morning, presented by First Commonwealth Bank here on AM 1160 WCCS 101.1 FM. And our interview with Jim Hock is brought to you by Bradley's Book Outlet in the Indiana Mall. And he is the author, along with Michael Downs, of Hollywood's team, Grit, Glamour, and the 1950s Los Angeles Rams. Let's say good morning to Jim Hock. Good morning to you.
Hey, great to be here. Honor to be on the show.
Wonderful to have you with us. And the book is about the 1950s Los Angeles Rams, with whom you have a very personal connection.
Absolutely. So my dad was a professional football player, played for the Rams in the 1950s, as well as, believe it or not, the Chicago Cardinals. And when my dad passed away in 2000, we had a memorial service in Los Angeles with a lot of his old teammates, and they were telling war stories of what it was like to play football back in the 50s. And my brother hit me on the shoulder and said, "Hey, I'm not a writer. You are. You should write these up." So I started interviewing a lot of the guys on the Rams, as well as players outside the Rams who played in the NFL, Frank Gifford and Art Donovan and Andy Robustelli and others, and kind of turned it into a book. And honestly, was only going to kind of use it for kind of a family history and give it to my mom and my siblings. And eventually it became a book, and I had a friend in the book business who said, "Hey, the Rams are moving back to Los Angeles. You have a book called Hollywood's Team. You should really get this published." So we found a great publisher, and the rest is history, and it's great to be talking to you about it.
Now, you were born after your dad's football career was over, correct?
Correct, yeah. Unfortunately, I never got to see my dad play live. I've seen him on tape, but grew up with a lot of the stories, and I'm the youngest of 7 kids, and both my parents are from Los Angeles, so I was always fascinated by the era of the 1950s in football. It was a different time. My mother was an elementary school teacher, while my dad was a Pro Bowl NFL offensive lineman, and they essentially made the same amount in annual salary. So just, stories like that and just how different the game was just always fascinated me. So just spent a lot of time, talking to folks who had played and others and family members, etc. And it was really, a way to deal with the grief that any of us go through when we lose a parent as well.
Now, your dad obviously told you many stories, and you heard these many stories. What was it like for you to actually research the life and the career of a guy that was your dad, and yet you didn't know when all of this was happening? To get to know him as a younger man, what was that like for you?
Yeah, it was a blast. I mean, I highly recommend anyone to kind of look back at their own history. But my dad was a quiet, the classic offensive lineman, the workhorse who just kind of was humble in the background. And, I've always been fascinated with people like my dad, but, whether that's in a radio station, the people behind the scenes that you work with that make things happen, or in a business or in a government. And the offensive line to me are those types of folks. And so for me, talking to a lot of those former players, doing the research, going to the NFL Hall of Fame, looking at the archival material, old films, was just fascinating to not only see my dad's experience, but also what it was like in the 1950s. And, the country was dramatically moving west in terms of population growth after World War II. The population of Los Angeles, for example, almost doubled in the 10 or so years after World War II. So there was this incredible growth, dynamism, and, the Rams were an interesting team at the time because there was only 12 teams in the league. There was no Southern teams. Hollywood was infused. Bob Hope was one of their part owners at the time. They had, filled with Hall of Famers. But like I said, they were the first professional football team to move west of the Mississippi River, the first team to integrate in the modern era, the year before Jackie Robinson did with the Dodgers. The first team with a TV contract, the first team, that reached 1 million fans in a season, first team with a logo on their helmet. In a lot of ways, they were the first modern professional pro sports franchise in football. So just an incredible amount of stories that I was able to dig up.
One of the stories, of course, is the migration of the Dodgers and the Los Angeles pursuit of the Dodgers at the same time that the Rams were establishing themselves. But your dad and family, we're right here in the middle of Steelers country. You were Pittsburgh folks before they were Pittsburgh folks, before your dad as a kid moved out.
Yeah, exactly. My dad's dad, my grandfather, worked for U.S. Steel in the 1920s and 30s, and unfortunately he had lost his job like too many people did during the Depression, and was really struggling to find work. And so when my dad was 9, he grew up in Pittsburgh and was the youngest of two kids in his family, said, I'm looking for opportunity. Your cousin just moved to California. There's jobs out there. So on the walk home from school, my grandfather drives past my dad and said, I'll see you in a month. I'm going to California. So for my dad, that was the other side of the world. He had no idea. And so they moved from Pittsburgh to Los Angeles in about 1937, and kind of classic move across the country without anything and looking for opportunity. And my grandpa struggled to have, find some work, but was able to eventually kind of settle himself. And so my dad kind of was born in Pittsburgh, loved the East Coast. My grandparents loved the East Coast, loved Pittsburgh, but wanted to, obviously put food on the table, so they felt like they had to move for job opportunities.
Jim Hock is our guest. Hollywood's team, grit, glamour, and the 1950s Los Angeles Rams. I love the way you developed the story of Los Angeles and what's happening in it at the time. But this particular football team was just loaded with characters, and all you need to do really is take a look at the nicknames, and the faces come right back to us, even in this day and age, 50, 60, even 70 years ago. The Dutchman, Norm Van Brocklin, Crazy Legs Hirsch, Night Train Lane. These are all part of the team on which your dad was a member. And it's fascinating to me that he's quiet and he assumes that offensive lineman's anonymity, while all about him are the shining lights of Hollywood and the shining lights of the NFL with those guys on the team.
No, exactly. It was a great question because they were, and this is what I found so interesting. There's a juxtaposition of people like my dad and his buddies on the offensive line with these amazing mega stars in the NFL. I mean, you walk through the NFL Hall of Fame, it's kind of filled with Rams at the time. You mentioned Norm Van Brocklin, the Dutchman, Crazy Legs Hirsch, their wide receiver, Bob Waterfield, another quarterback who was married to Jane Russell, the famous actress, Tom Fears, Les Richter. But even, their coach, one of their coaches in the 50s, Sid Gilman, was one of the architects of the modern passing game. He's in the NFL Hall of Fame. Their public relations man, and also who became their general manager in the 50s, became the commissioner of the NFL, Pete Rozelle, the boy commissioner, if you will. But he had learned a lot of those things about television and marketing with the Rams in the 50s, and really took it nationally with the league wide, and really kind of put the league on the map. And is probably will go down in history as probably the greatest commissioner in all of professional sports. So it was just a who's who. I had mentioned, Bob Hope is an owner, but Hollywood was infused in the Rams. One of the players was married to Diane Disney, Walt Disney's daughter.
Mm-hmm.
My mother always said that, actors and actresses and comedians were always at games and the parties, and so it was a great atmosphere.
One aspect of the book that is particularly poignant to me is watching your dad struggle with his bad knees and how difficult it was in that day to get what we would consider to be proper and normal treatment now, and to understand how much pain he was in order to do what he did and to stay as long as he did it's just, to me, a fascinating dynamic of this whole book. Your dad really struggled to stay in the sport, and it seems as if he struggled to stay in sport simply because he loved to play football.
Exactly. He loved football. He, went to Santa Clara University, which back then in Northern California played in the Orange Bowl, and was highly recruited out of high school, could have gone anywhere, Notre Dame, USC, picked a small school because he always said he wanted to be a bigger fish in a smaller pond, and was extremely successful, was drafted by the Cardinals. Curly Lambeau, who was the coach of the Cardinals at the time, and then was traded to his hometown team. But he just absolutely loved football, and I felt I couldn't tell the story. We felt we couldn't tell the story with my dad without kind of telling the story about his knees and the struggle with his knees. And his knees are almost a character, if you will, in the book, much like L.A. is almost a character. But here he was, a young guy who made the Pro Bowl. He's kind of at the pinnacle of his career, and then his knees just kind of fall out. So it's also a story of challenges, resilience, that we all go through, throughout our lives. And to him, his life was over when he couldn't play football anymore, but he was able to kind of transition into the business world. That's deciding not to go into coaching. But, I'm glad you picked that up because there's the knees are kind of throughout the book. his struggle
Yeah.
with kind of staying on the field.
Well, a part of that entire story as well is your mom, and she was a great contributor to this book. It's very clear as you read the book how much you love your mom and how much she loved your dad.
Oh, thank you for saying that. Yeah, no, my parents were a true partnership, and my mother, like I said, was kind of integral to the story and wanted to tell their story to young kids who kind of grew up right within walking distance to the Coliseum. They could literally walk to the Coliseum from both their homes. And my mom was a third grade teacher. At the time, my dad was a professional football player, and she made exactly the same amount of money in salary, believe it or not, as a Pro Bowl NFL lineman. But eventually went on to have 7 kids, and I was lucky to be the 7th. Yeah, they were a true partnership, and wanted to kind of show their love affair throughout the book, and family is kind of weaved throughout the book as well.
His name is Jim Hock. With Michael Downs, he's written the book Hollywood's Team, Grit, Glamour, and the 1950s Los Angeles Rams. It's a wonderful read, and I'm so appreciative of you for spending some time with us this morning here on Indiana in the Morning.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.